Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
It was one of those perfect suburban afternoons that look like they were pulled straight out of a catalog. The kind where sunlight filters through the trees just right, the grill's smoke curls lazily into the air, and everyone's pretending they like each other. My mom had arranged everything, of course. The plastic tablecloth with the faded red checks, the little name cards she thought were cute, the store-bought cupcakes she dusted with powdered sugar as if that could disguise the fact that they were dry as dust. I was there early, as always, setting up chairs, arranging condiments, making sure the mosquito candles were lit. Nobody noticed. By the time everyone arrived, my sister floated in like a queen returning from her latest triumph. She had that smile, the one she's perfected over years of being the golden child, equal parts charm and calculation. She wore a white sundress that caught the light perfectly, and she had that casual confidence that comes from a lifetime of applause. Everyone clapped when she walked in, as though her mere presence deserved recognition. My mother called her my accomplished girl, and my father, beer in hand, beamed like a man who'd raised a prodigy. Dinner stretched out under the fading sun, all laughter and shallow questions. My sister told some story about a new project at her firm, something involving executive restructuring I didn't even try to follow. I was too busy making sure no one's glass ran dry, collecting stray napkins, and trying not to notice how no one ever asked what I'd been working on lately. When my father stood up, tapping his glass with a fork, the whole table went quiet, waiting for the moment. He lifted his beer and said, "To our amazing daughter for showing what real success looks like." Everyone raised their glasses toward my sister. I felt the sting before I could even brace for it. I half smiled, nodding as if I were in on the celebration, though my stomach had tightened like a fist. The words blurred into the background, laughter echoing like wind chimes made of glass. I wasn't angry. Anger takes energy. I was just empty. When the toast ended, I gathered the plates. No one offered to help. My mother said, "Oh honey, you don't have to do that," without moving an inch. I stacked dishes higher than I should have, balancing them against my hip like a waitress who'd worked one shift too many. My sister was still talking, her voice carrying across the yard as if she were on stage, my parents hanging on every word. I caught a reflection of myself in the kitchen window, hair tied back, arms wet with dishwater, jaw set, and for a moment, I didn't recognize the woman staring back. That's when something shifted inside me. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It was like a light quietly flicking off in a room no one noticed was lit. I realized I had spent decades existing in the background of other people's lives, applauding from the sidelines while they pretended I didn't have my own story to tell. I thought about all the small things: birthdays skimmed over, phone calls unanswered, the way my mother always introduced me as our other daughter. It wasn't hatred that built up in me that night. It was clarity. I finished cleaning, stacked everything neatly, and excused myself. No one even asked where I was going. I walked out to my car, the cool night air wrapping around me like something both comforting and cruel. As I closed the door, I looked back toward the house. Through the kitchen window, I could see them laughing, heads tilted toward my sister. I started the engine and let the music fill the silence. The song playing was one my mother used to love when I was a kid, ironic really. She once said it reminded her of hope. When I got home, the house felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. I poured a glass of water, sat at the table, and stared at the condensation running down the glass. There's a strange peace that comes after disappointment, when you realize you don't have to try anymore. I thought about texting my sister something polite, something that would keep the peace. But then I laughed. For the first time in a long while, I laughed quietly, bitterly, but real. Hours passed. The street outside went silent. I turned off the lights and let the dark fill the room. My phone buzzed against the table once, twice, 3 times. I ignored it. The 4th time I looked. The screen lit up with her name. My sister. I almost didn't open it, assuming it was some cheerful thank you or a photo of her and Mom smiling. But it wasn't. Her message was short. Just one line. "Mom's been crying nonstop." Why? I stared at it for a long time, reading it over and over. The corners of my mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but close. I didn't answer. I just set the phone down, leaned back, and watched the tiny blinking light fade. Outside, a dog barked somewhere in the distance. The night air drifted through the open window, cool and calm. Whatever had broken at that dinner table wasn't loud. It was quiet, almost polite, but it was irreversible. And as I sat there, in that silence that finally belonged to me, I realized I wasn't invisible anymore. I had simply stopped performing. By morning, the cookout felt like a movie I had watched from the wrong row, the kind where your neck hurts and the sound is a little warped, and as I made coffee I scrolled back to my sister's message, read it once more with the same detached curiosity I reserve for weather alerts, and then set the phone face down because if I started explaining it would turn into the usual performance where I soften every edge to keep people comfortable, where I take the hit so the family can keep pretending. The script still works, and I decided I was done with that role even if no one had noticed I had been playing it for years. What people never see, probably because I learned to make it look effortless, is the quiet maintenance work that keeps a family's mythology running, all those calendar reminders, bill payments, corrected typos in official forms, late-night rebookings when someone forgot a flight, pharmacy pickups handled under someone else's name, and yes, the donations made in honor of the golden child that somehow traced back to the card in my wallet because it was linked to the family account I had created. When our parents were still figuring out passwords on sticky notes, I built the little bridge that let my sister look like the kind of person who always remembered birthdays with flowers and always followed through with monthly charity pledges. And I built it so well I almost believed it myself. I work at a mid-sized accounting office where the smell of toner and coffee feels like a second bloodstream, and while I never directly handled my parents' personal finances, I had, out of convenience and because I wanted things to function, set up a modest shared dashboard a few years back when Dad forgot to renew insurance and Mom cried at the pharmacy because the copay shocked her, so I created automation where I could, added reminders where I could not, and kept the whole thing humming with little tune-ups that felt like kindness until the night of the toast when the words "real success" landed like a paper cut in the same spot that has never healed. The smartest revenge rarely announces itself with a trumpet. It simply withdraws the invisible labor that allowed the lie to hold shape. So after finishing my coffee, I opened the dashboard and began a series of tiny, polite corrections that anyone could defend in daylight, starting with removing my personal card from the florist account that delivered those cheerful monthly bouquets in my sister's name to our mother's door. A gesture Mom loved and praised and posted about with captions that made my stomach clench, and then I unlinked my saved payment from the Community Foundation portal where an automatic recurring pledge credited to "Our Accomplished Girl" had lived for 2 quiet years. And then I went into the shared reminders and shifted every task I had created for myself to the original owners by reassigning the medication alerts back to Dad's phone and the insurance notifications back to Mom's email and the party planning checklist back to the sister whose talent for delegating had always been praised as leadership. None of this was dramatic and none of it was unkind, yet each click felt like opening a window in a house that had grown stale, and with the air came the soft creak of accountability, which is a noise people often confuse with betrayal. And as I worked I kept a small, wry humor going in my head to steady the nerves, telling myself that if invisibility were an Olympic sport I would medal, but the sport had closed for the season and the athlete had decided to retire without a press conference. The only thing that might qualify as a push rather than a withdrawal involved my sister's little side project, that glossy, give-back effort she loved to mention at brunches, a registered nonprofit with a pretty website and a photo carousel of smiling kids. A project Mom chaired as treasurer even though she hates spreadsheets and never balanced a checkbook in her life, and because the filing deadline sat squarely in my office calendar like an accusatory post-it, I had, earlier this year, tidied a few lines to keep them in compliance, noting small expenses that had been routed through the wrong card and a vendor receipt that looked suspiciously like a personal shopping spree disguised as outreach supplies. Those notes had been sitting in draft because I kept telling myself it would embarrass them, and embarrassment is the third rail in our family. but the kitchen window reflection from last night would not leave me alone. I reviewed the draft one more time, added a gentle memo explaining that corrective entries were routine and healthy, included links to the IRS guidance my office keeps bookmarked for nonprofit volunteers. And with hands that felt steady in a way I had not felt steady in years, I hit submit so the system would email the treasurer on file, which was our mother, and copy the listed executive director, which was my sister, and route the flagged receipt for verification, which is to say I chose transparency over tradition, and if tradition cried, that was not my fault. Around noon, while I was cleaning out my car of the forgotten plastic forks and the paper crown Mom had laid at my sister's seat for fun, my phone began to do that little nervous dance on the console. First with a text from my sister asking if I had time to chat, then with another saying Mom was in tears and believed she had messed everything up. Then with a call from our father that I let roll to voicemail because I was not going to play interpreter for feelings I did not create, and as I sat there with the engine off and the windows cracked, the dashboard chimed again, this time with a confirmation that the florist had removed the saved card and that future deliveries would require a new payment method. I answered my sister with a single sentence that sounded kind and tasted like steel, telling her that Mom was capable and that the foundation would be fine once the paperwork matched the reality. And before she could reply with the usual guilt-tinged deflection, I opened the Community Gala sponsorship portal, where a banner her firm loved to parade had been extended year after year on the promise of a check I kept arranging. And I let the renewal lapse with a click that felt like a breath, then forwarded the sponsor packet to the firm's general inbox addressed to a role, not a person, with a cheerful note that said, "Happy to hand this back to the rightful team," and as I watched the sent confirmation flash, my sister's new message arrived on the lock screen. Longer this time and edged with panic, asking what I had done and whether I realized how this would look. I put the phone face down on the passenger seat, turned the key, listened to the engine catch, and allowed myself one small, unladylike laugh that would never make it into a family scrapbook, because while I had not burned anything, I had removed the hand that kept the tablecloth from slipping, and the plates were beginning to slide, and somewhere across town a treasurer email was opening with the subject line "Action Required, Clarifications Needed." And just as I pulled into traffic, my phone started to ring again, but this time it was not my sister or my father. It was an unknown number tagged as the Foundation's bank, and I let it ring until the sound cut out and the car was filled with a silence that felt suspiciously like power. By the time afternoon slid into that burnished hour when sunlight turns every ordinary thing theatrical, the consequences of pressing send and unhooking myself from other people's good deeds had begun to arrive in a steady, almost polite procession. Because when you stop being the quiet gear in a creaky clock, the hands don't just keep moving out of habit. They stutter, they clack, and eventually they reveal how much of the motion came from you, which is a revelation that tends to upset the ones who mistook your labor for fate. The Foundation Bank, whose number I had ignored in the car, left a message that was both friendly and firm, explaining that a routine discrepancy check had flagged a small series of purchases that needed receipts attached, and that until the treasurer confirmed the purpose, the account would show a temporary hold on outgoing payments, which in normal life would be a nudge and a shrug, but in the curated world my sister lived in sounded like a pulled fire alarm, because her social rhythm depended on uninterrupted gestures of generosity that could be photographed and captioned, not on the unglamorous business of reconciling line items and submitting mileage logs that did not involve a boutique on the way home. At the office I behaved as if it were any other Tuesday, which is a game I play well because normalcy keeps panic from drafting you into its pity parade. Yet while I reviewed a client's quarterly estimates, I opened our family dashboard in a separate window and completed the one change that felt less like revenge and more like a necessary graduation, which was filing the form to remove myself as the responsible party for the shared email alias that had, for years, caught every overdue notice, every calendar ping, every security prompt when someone forgot a password and needed a code sent, just this once, and the form took maybe 5 minutes and required only a digital signature, but the sensation of signing was bigger. As if I finally handed the microphone back to the people who had been speaking over a soundtrack they did not realize I controlled. In the early evening, when the office emptied and the printer groaned its last page, I sent one final message from my work email to the Foundation's general inbox, an utterly wholesome note addressed to the board address that had never been used, suggesting we schedule a simple compliance check-in before their fall fundraiser so Mom could feel confident and the filings would be beautifully boring, and I included a calendar link with 3 options and a gentle checklist of what they'd need to bring, namely the treasurer's ledger, the receipts, and the signed minutes no one ever remembers to sign. And I CC'd the free legal clinic our firm partners with for nonprofits, not because I wanted drama, but because sunlight is healthy for things that want to live. My sister called twice, and I let both attempts slide away, partly because I knew the sound of her voice would be that mix of tremble and performance that has always loosened my spine, and partly because every time I grant immediate access, I become the emergency exit people sprint through when the alarms wail, which keeps them from learning where the front door is. And I am tired of being the map and the key and the apologetic usher waving a flashlight in the aisle. Mom texted, not with the usual barrage of hearts and exclamation points, but with a single line that read, "I think I ruined everything," which would have melted me on any other day, yet I forced myself to answer with a long, calm paragraph that told her she had not ruined anything, that numbers are not moral verdicts, that grown women can fix paperwork and learn new habits and still host a beautiful fundraiser where nobody knows the sausage got made 12 hours earlier. And then I added a line about how proud she would feel signing the ledger herself, which is the kind of compliment that feels like a hand on the back rather than a leash around the neck. For my own brand of justice, the one that dresses up as good governance so it can walk right into the party without a disguise, I built a quiet boundary inside my day job that would outlast any family tantrum. Drafting a memo to my manager proposing stronger segregation of duties for any client whose volunteer treasurer is a relative of an employee, a neutral policy that just happened to mean I could no longer be the ghost in our foundation's machine. And when he replied with a thumbs up sentence and an appreciative note about my ethics radar, I felt a pulse of something like joy, not the kind that comes from trophies or toasts, but the steadier kind that feels like standing up and realizing your legs still belong to you. Near dusk, the first visible fallout rippled across the surface in a way even the neighbors could have noticed if they were the type to peer through blinds, because cardboard bouquets began arriving at Mom's door like awkward confessions, each stamped with "payment required" or "update method," and the community gala sent a mass email listing sponsors without our family firm's usual logo, which prompted 2 separate acquaintances to text me screenshots with "Is this a mistake?" in that tone. That pretends concern while sniffing for gossip, and I replied to both with a cheerful "looks accurate," which cost me nothing and saved me years. I thought the night would end with silence, the kind I have started to enjoy because it has weight and shape when it's earned, but just as I slipped my laptop into its sleeve and reached for the lights, a new email bounced into my inbox from a state-chartered compliance office that handles nonprofit irregularities reported through an automated triage system, not an audit and not a scandal. Just a templated notice asking the treasurer to schedule a routine consultation to ensure best practices. And, because the system CC'd the person who submitted the corrective entry that triggered the triage, which in this case was me, my name sat there, plain as day, next to my work signature, and within a minute my phone lit up with my sister's message. Long and breathless, ending with a question that could break a family if you read it out loud. Did you report us to the state? And, do you understand what happens if this gets public? The call from my sister came just after dawn, her voice heavy with a brittle calm that tried and failed to sound in control, the kind of tone people use when they're rehearsing for a crisis that's already halfway through collapsing. She said the bank had frozen the foundation's main account pending review, that donors were asking questions she didn't know how to answer, and that Mom hadn't stopped crying since dinner, convinced she'd somehow caused the whole mess by misplacing a single receipt. I listened without interrupting, my hand tracing invisible circles on the kitchen counter, the morning light turning the surface into a pale reflection of my face, and when she finally paused to breathe, I said quietly that sometimes people cry not because they're innocent, but because they finally see themselves clearly. There was silence on the other end, then a low exhale, and she hung up without saying goodbye. For years I had believed that my family's dysfunction was built on noise, raised voices, cutting remarks, exaggerated praise that echoed too loudly around the people who needed none and never reached the ones who did. But what I was beginning to realize was that the real foundation had been quiet compliance. Every kind gesture I made, every overlooked slight, every unspoken apology for existing differently had been a plank in the bridge that let them walk across me without noticing. Now, with that bridge dismantled piece by piece, everyone seemed shocked to find the river between us so deep. Mom's messages began arriving like small storms, first confusion, then guilt, then a desperate insistence that we fix this before people find out. She wrote about reputations and family names, as if those had ever shielded us from disappointment, and I responded with the kind of neutral reassurance accountants are trained to give clients when panic outweighs logic. Everything can be resolved, I wrote. Transparency is the cure, not the disease. It was probably too measured, too calm, because an hour later she replied with, "You sound like you don't care at all." And maybe I didn't, at least not in the way she meant. That evening, after work, I drove by their house, not intending to go inside, but to see the familiar porch light that had once felt like a signal of safety. The blinds were open just enough to reveal my father pacing the living room with a drink in hand, my mother sitting on the couch with tissues crumpled at her feet, and my sister near the window, phone in hand, head bowed. I could almost hear the argument from the way their bodies moved, my father insisting that this would blow over, my mother pleading for someone to take responsibility, my sister trying to rewrite the story in real time, already framing herself as the misunderstood victim of a bureaucratic mistake. It struck me how rehearsed they all looked, like actors cycling through a familiar scene, unaware the script had already changed. I didn't knock. Instead, I sat in my car until the light in the living room dimmed, then drove away, past the quiet streets of the neighborhood that had watched our family pretend perfection for decades. Somewhere between the traffic lights, I realized that revenge wasn't always about inflicting pain. Sometimes it was about creating the space for truth to echo without interruption. The echo can be unbearable, but it's honest. By the end of the week, the gossip had begun to seep through the polite circles that thrived on charity events and garden parties. A local columnist published a short note about a procedural issue involving a family-run nonprofit, careful not to name names but obvious enough for anyone who mattered. My sister texted me again, this time with fury disguised as diplomacy. "You need to fix this before Mom breaks down completely." I typed a reply, deleted it, and instead sent a single sentence. I didn't break anything, I just stopped holding it together. Work became my refuge, though even there the world had started to tilt slightly. My manager called me into his office, not to reprimand me but to thank me for the compliance report I'd written, saying it might be used as a training model for future audits. As he spoke, I watched the reflection of myself in his office window, calm, professional, unbothered, and wondered how that could coexist with the version of me that used to cry quietly in the bathroom after every family dinner, where my father compared our achievements and called my sister the pride of the family. A few nights later, while I was reading in bed, a soft knock echoed through my apartment door. It was Mom. She looked smaller, as if some invisible scaffolding had been removed. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a tin of cookies she must have baked hours earlier, the gesture both apology and nostalgia. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and said she couldn't sleep, that every time she closed her eyes she saw the emails, the freezing of accounts, the whispered questions from her friends at church. Then, in a tone I hadn't heard since childhood, she asked, "Why did you do this, Lena? We were fine." The words hung there like a smoke alarm that wouldn't stop. I told her we weren't fine, we were rehearsed. We'd built a family on selective sight, pretending that if we clapped loudly enough for one child, the other wouldn't notice the silence. She started to speak, but I stopped her gently, saying that I wasn't angry anymore, just tired of pretending that fairness required me to vanish. For the first time, she didn't argue. She just nodded, eyes glistening, as if realizing that love without accountability is only decoration. When she left, she hugged me in a way that felt both desperate and hollow, like she was clinging to the memory of something that had already dissolved. After the door closed, I stood in the quiet kitchen, the scent of her cookies mixing with the faint trace of her perfume, and it struck me how peaceful the apartment felt, not empty, not cold, but balanced. The silence was no longer a punishment. It was a form of closure that no apology could ever provide. My phone buzzed once more just before midnight. It was my sister again, her message shorter this time, stripped of the usual polish. "Mom says she can't stop crying." "What did you tell her?" I looked at the glowing screen for a long moment, then placed it face down on the counter without replying. Outside, a soft rain began to fall, tapping against the glass like an old rhythm coming to an end, and I knew that the unraveling wasn't chaos, it was simply the truth, finally free from the noise that used to drown it. Morning arrived like a faint echo after a long storm, the kind where the air feels unnaturally clean yet every sound carries a shadow of what came before. I woke earlier than usual, not because of guilt or anxiety, but because silence had its own gravity now, drawing me toward it like something that needed to be acknowledged. The light coming through the window painted my living room in soft gold, touching the framed photos I hadn't yet taken down, my sister's wedding, our parents' anniversary, a family Christmas where everyone was smiling except me. I stared at that one the longest, wondering if the camera had caught what I had felt that day, the isolation that can exist even when you're surrounded by people who call you their own. The phone lay on the counter, face down, still and waiting. I hadn't answered any of the messages since last night, though the unread notifications stacked like unanswered questions, and I knew that somewhere in those words was the one I both dreaded and expected, the inevitable request to undo, to fix, to pretend. Instead, I poured myself coffee, black and sharp, and let the quiet shape itself into something that resembled peace. It's a strange thing to realize that after years of being treated like background noise, the only thing you truly crave is silence on your own terms. By noon, I finally picked up the phone. The latest text was from my sister again, a paragraph written in the tone of someone performing calmness, while their world tilted beneath them. She wrote that Mom hadn't left her room all morning, that Dad was talking about closing the foundation entirely, that the neighbors had started asking why the family's name had disappeared from the donor list for the local hospital. At the end of it, the familiar question blinked up at me again. "Why did you do this?" The irony, of course, was that they still thought it was something I did, as if I had lit a match rather than simply stopped holding up the walls they had built on denial. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened the balcony door, letting the cool wind sweep in. The world outside seemed perfectly ordinary, kids riding bikes, a couple walking their dog, the faint hum of lawnmowers, the sort of day that reminds you that the universe doesn't pause for private reckonings. I sat there for a long time, thinking about the shape of revenge and how it isn't always sharp or immediate. Sometimes it's the slow erosion of pretense, the quiet withdrawal of effort that people mistook for love. My parents had raised us to believe that goodness meant gratitude, even when the scale was tilted so far it might as well have been nailed that way. My sister learned to receive, and I learned to endure. But endurance, I've discovered, is a poor substitute for respect. That afternoon, I drove to the edge of town where the old office of the foundation still stood, a neat brick building with the sign half faded from years of summer heat. The parking lot was empty except for a single car I recognized as my father's. Through the glass door, I could see him sitting inside, shoulders heavy, staring at the framed awards on the wall, all those plaques engraved with our family name, polished symbols of decency that now seemed to mock the truth. I thought about going in, saying something gentle, but what words could possibly mend a lifetime of selective blindness? Instead, I stood there for a few minutes, watching him through the reflection of the glass, realizing that this was the first time I had ever seen him look small. Then I turned back toward my car, the crunch of gravel under my shoes sounding louder than anything he could have said. When I returned home, the answering machine light blinked, an old habit of my mother's, leaving messages instead of facing the silence of a call. Her voice trembled as she said she forgave me, though she didn't understand me, and that she hoped I'd remember that family was all we really have. The irony of that last sentence settled like a stone in my chest. Family, I thought, is only what survives when the pretending stops. As evening fell, I sat by the window again, the phone still in front of me, the screen lighting up every few minutes with the persistence of someone who refuses to accept the end of a story. My sister's final message arrived just after sunset. Mom's been crying nonstop. Why? The same words as before, like an echo trapped in time, looping back to the night everything began. I could almost see her typing, waiting, her polished life fraying at the edges in a way she had never imagined. I began typing back, slowly at first, then faster, the words forming almost on their own. Tell Mom I finally stopped trying. It was honest, and maybe it was cruel, though I wasn't sure anymore if those two things were different. My thumb hovered over the send button for a long moment. Then I deleted the message. There was nothing left to explain. Outside, the sky darkened to that deep indigo that hides everything but the faintest traces of light. I placed the phone face down once more and let the quiet stretch out, steady and deliberate. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I simply felt unseen by choice, a difference so profound it might as well have been freedom. Somewhere, my mother was still crying, my sister still defending, my father still brooding, but none of it reached me anymore. I had stepped outside their orbit, and the world hadn't ended. It had only grown still. And in that stillness, where no apology could travel and no justification was required, I finally understood that revenge had never been the point. It was just the doorway. What waited beyond it was something harder, quieter, and infinitely more powerful, the decision to no longer need to be understood.